Alrighty, in this video what I'm going to do is go ahead and show you guys some built-in ways to create observables. I am going to go ahead and move that, oops, that was source client. I'm going to go ahead and move that create subscriber out into a file that we can include. So in our source server, I'll go ahead and create a new folder called lib, and I'll just put in util.js. And then for this, I'm simply going to grab this create subscriber method, pull it out, and then export it here. And then, of course, to fix our example 1, we have to import create subscriber from that. So we simply come up here to the top, and we say from lib util. So this is just going to be a nice little utility method that we can use to create subscribers when all we care about is printing their items out into the screen. But anyway, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at a handful of built-in subscribers. Now, these methods are very simple. There's not a whole lot to talk about, but they're important. They're very, very, very important. So let's get started. In my source server, I'm going to create example 02 built-in.js. My gulp task is running, so I should already have a built-in.js here, and I do, as well as my lib. And for built-in.js, I'm going to import Rx from RxJS Rx. And I'm going to import our, whatever I called that method, create subscriber from our lib util. Now remember to put in that dot slash because it's relative. Now let's go ahead and execute it with nodemon. So npm run nodemon build example 02 built in and hit enter. Now the first one I want to show you guys is basically the thing that we did before. So I can simply say Rx observable interval 500 milliseconds, and I'm going to say take 5. We've already introduced the concept of the take operator. It takes X amount of items, then it completes the then it unsubscribes, and of course by unsubscribing, the interval, because it uses set interval, is going to stop. And then we'll say subscribe, create subscriber 1, and hit Control S. And not surprisingly, it does exactly what we saw before. So interval is not incredibly interesting, but it's very, very, very useful. There's a reason why it's a built-in function. We also have, let's just rename this to interval. We also have Rx observable timer, and for timer, we pass in a due time, which is going to be a date object or a relative time in milliseconds. So we could say timer 1 second, subscribe, create subscriber, timer, and go ahead and save that out. And we have an error because that's not how you spell subscribe. So we get timer 0, timer complete after 1 second. Let's make this 5 seconds to make that a little bit more apparent there. So interval next, and then we get our timer complete. Notice that the process didn't exit until the timer finished. That's because the timer creates a set timeout, and the set timeout will keep the process alive. We can also use a timer to create an interval. So I can go ahead and comment out our interval example, and for my timer, I'll go ahead and say start in 1 second, and then have a period of 500 milliseconds. So you see it waited 1 second to start, and then it started emitting items. Of course, we can take 3, so it doesn't do that and distract me while I'm talking. Okay, so we have a timer. And again, these are primitive functions. They're, in and of themselves, aren't too interesting unless, of course, you are you need a timer for some reason. And if you do need a timer, look at it. It's way simpler than setting up create set interval and set timeout. I really want to point that out because not only does it do our set interval and set timer for us, it automatically cleans itself up when it's done, and that's so cool. So already we can see an example of how using these primitive, basic generators makes things easier. All right, let's talk about of and from. Now, these are going to be something rarely you'll use on your own, but are very, very powerful in the context of a workflow. So let's do Rx observable of, and we'll do hello world. Also notice I do get IntelliSense with ReSharper code because of the way that they wrote their comments, and I think that's really cool. Then I'll do dot subscribe, create subscriber, and we'll do of. So that looks really simple, doesn't it? RxObservable of hello world simply prints out that one item, and then it completes. But remember this one. Remember of is a very, very, very handy thing. We can also pass in multiple items. So hello world 42, whoa. So notice how we get a next for each item we passed in, and then we get a complete. But what would happen if we passed an array? So we have a problem here. I passed in an array. Well, let's do multiple items. We get of.next, this is an array, comma, hey. Now, that's not necessarily what we want. What if we wanted to pass an array and have each one of the items we passed in become its own item? Well, that's where from comes in. So RxObservable from, and from and of are so easy to confuse. So I'm really, really trying to try this point home. These are very, very useful tools for our workflows. But of and from are different. Of takes in multiple arguments, and each one of those arguments becomes an onNext, regardless of if any of those arguments are an iterable or an array. From, however, will take an array-like thing and flatten it out. So if I try to do from hey, and then subscribe, create subscriber from, well, that's a bad example. Let's say I said from 43. We get an error. So notice that from is expecting an iterable thing. So we could pass an array here. I could say 23, 10, 5, or 4. And we get 23, 10, and 4. It also can take in an iterable. So if I create a generator function, like function generate, and say yield 1, yield 5, yield hey, and I passed in, that generate into this, we're getting an error because I don't have the runtime for iterables installed right now from Browserify. You can actually see that in the built code. If I jump over to the built-in, notice how it's trying to get a reference to this regenerator runtime object that doesn't exist. That's because I don't have the compatibility library installed in our Babelify processor. But this code would work if we had a thing that returned an iterable of anything, even a generator function. But it won't work in this case, and it's a little bit beyond the scope of what I'm trying to do to install that runtime, so I'm not going to worry about it. But from is really cool. So from is used, again, to flatten arrays. And that might make a little bit more sense why originally when I passed in a string, I was expecting an error, but in reality, I got exactly what should happen. It iterated over the string because the string is an iterable-like thing. So we got every single character. But from is so useful because we can take from and we can convert an array of something into something else so that we can process. Like, let's say I had an array of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I wanted to multiply them all by 5. So I could do observable from array, map I goes into I times 5. And now they're all multiplied by 5. So from is a great way to convert an existing array into a stream of items so that you can perform your transformations on them. All right, one last one. Or actually, I think we can do 3 more of these basic ones. Let's do an error. This is also a very handy one. If you want to just terminate a sequence and return an error, but you need to pass in an observable that wraps an error, we can do RxObservable throw new error hey, and I can say subscribe, create subscription error, and see we get the error.error. Now, that's different. Now, this is an important concept. If I said from, and I passed in an array with a new error in it, and I saved it, look at that. We get from.next, not a number for some reason. Oh yeah, because we mapped it. Let's take off the map. We get from.next error, hey. We got next called. Remember, passing an error into an observable and making it an observable with using either from or of does not throw an error. It does not cause the error to be thrown. It does not terminate the sequence. This is useful behavior because sometimes, you know what? Sometimes it might be a valid thing for an error to happen and we don't want to terminate our sequence. So we might want to package up our error and emit it as an item. But when we do throw, whatever we pass in, even if it's just a number, it'll throw an error. The throw observable will always throw an error. Here's another one. This one you might not see any use for, and you might have an idea of what's going to happen. Actually, before I hit save, what do you think is going to happen right here? Observable.empty. Now, observable.empty, you might go like, wow, that's a really dumb function. Why would you ever do that? Well, the answer is sometimes you need to have a function that might return items under some condition, or it might return nothing under other conditions, but it has to return an observable. Like, you're in an observable workflow, you have to return something that can be subscribed to, but you don't want to return anything. So you use empty. So what do you think the output of this is going to be? Think about it for a sec. So let's go ahead and hit Control S. And we see empty.complete. So we still get the complete message. The sequence is still terminated, but we don't get any items, and that's what empty does. Let's do one more. Let's do defer. You might not have a lot of uses for this, but for the sake of completeness, I'll go ahead and show it to you. I'm going to say let side effect equals 0. Say RxObservable, or how about const defer equals RxObservable defer, and it takes in a function. And I'm going to say side effect plus plus. I'm going to say return RxObservable of side effect. Then I'm going to say defer dot subscribe, create subscriber. How about defer dot 1, and then we'll do 2 and 3. What do you think the output of this is going to be? Hit Control S. We get defer dot 1 next 1, defer 1 complete. Defer 2 next 2, defer 2 complete. Defer 3 next 3, defer 3 to complete. So what does this do? What defer does is it creates a observable that is going to, or it creates this generator function, kind of like creating our own custom observable, but it's a little bit more abstract than that. And it'll invoke this function every time it's subscribed to. And we can see proof of that because the first item was 1, the next was 2, the next was 3, and we're incrementing the side effect in the closure that we've captured outside of that scope. And then we simply return observable of side effect. So defer can be useful in certain circumstances, and it's worth knowing. It's worth being aware of these so you know when to use what. Actually, I lied. I do want to talk about 2 more operators that we can use to create things. And one of them is actually kind of important that I sort of forgot about. It's funny because I always take it for granted because I use it quite frequently, but I did kind of forget about it. And another one is kind of another silly one that that I guess we'll do first. And that's called never. So if I said RxObservable never subscribe, create subscriber, never, what do you think is going to happen? Well, we hit Control S, and we don't see anything. We don't see any never. Now remember, what's the difference between never and empty? Empty doesn't produce any items, but it completes. Never produces no items and never completes. And that's the difference. So if you ever need to, sometimes you use observables to signal to other observables. Like sometimes you might say, take this thing until this other thing happens. Well, in those cases, you might want to pass in a never, because that never will just never complete, and it'll never signal that observer. The last one I want to talk about, again, this is an important one. I can't believe I forgot about this. RxObservable range. Range will take in a start number and a total count. And then when we subscribe to it, hit Control S, it gives you exactly what you want, what you would expect. It gives us an item starting at the start number, and it gives us X amount of items where X is the second parameter. So it's very simple, very, very, very straightforward. As is all of these, really. These are, I like to think of all these guys as sort of primitives. They're just the built-in observables that we can kind of create for our own purposes. We can combine them and use them in interesting ways. So again, we have interval, which is basically set interval, timer, which is set timeout, plus potentially, if you pass in a second parameter, set interval, of, which just does a single item, from, which expands an array or an iterable, throw, which sends an error, empty, which simply completes and does nothing else, defer, which is used to create observables from side effects, or something that you only want this observable to actually do something until it's subscribed to, and never, which, well, never completes, and range, which gives us a nice numerical range. And that's it for built-in observables. In the next video, we're going to see how we can create observables from other frameworks. We're going to see how we can integrate the Reactive Extensions framework with things like Node and jQuery, or just straight up HTML elements. And we'll see you guys there.